It's a great pleasure for me to moderate this session, which is a conversation with authors session, which is of all the categories of events that we do at the Institute, my favourite, because it's the one where we get to talk to an author of a book. In this case, David Hurd, and the distinguished David Hurd, indeed, and of course the book, which I'm sure you've all seen, many of you have read, From Pearls to Oil, which came out this year. You might have heard David Hurd speak about the book at the last Abu Dhabi book forum or festival. The book fair, that's right, yeah. But it was also reviewed rather wonderfully and very engagingly by James Langton in the National, which I don't know if James Langton was in the audience, but that was I'm a great fan of that review, and it made me want to read the book, and it made me realize that it tells us very clearly and rather enthusiastically that it's a book that's important about the history of the transformation of the UAE, but it's also about people. And it's because it's about people that it is such an interesting book, as well as being about this country we all live in, and the institutions that have had such a key part in transforming it since the 1930s. So David has written this wonderfully informative book, which we should all read if we live in the Emirates. David then studied geology and physics in England. Seeking a more adventuresome life, he arrived in Abu Dhabi on the 4th of August 1963 to join a small team bringing on-stream new oil wells in the desert. He was the engineer in the field, overseeing the production of the first oil from the giant Asab and Sahel fields during the 1960s. He married the German historian Dr. Frauke Hurd-Bey, who I'm delighted to see in the audience, who joined him in Abu Dhabi in 1967. They witnessed the establishment of the UAE federal state, and over the years have enjoyed the friendship of many of the citizens of this country. On many occasions, they met the first president of the UAE, the late Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan, and his brother Sheikh Shahboud. It's of course Sheikh Shahboud who plays such an important role in this book, and that's one of the most fascinating elements of the book, the character of Sheikh Shahboud. They now live in retirement in Abu Dhabi. David is also a member of the Travellers Club Chatham House, the Royal Society for Asian Affairs, and is a fellow of the Energy Institute. And he will be joining me in conversation about his book along with Nick Cochrane-Dyet, to my right, who is the special advisor to the chief representative, which includes providing counsel on BP's activities and a wide variety of other topics. Prior to joining BP, he was a captain in the British Army in the Brigade of the Gurkhas. He helped manage the president of the UAE's Royal Stud Farm and spent four years working as the representative of Citicorp Investment Bank in Abu Dhabi. A long-term resident, his father was an officer in the Trucial Oman Scouts prior to the UAE's formation. His interests include travel, language, and photography. And then to my left, my good friend and colleague Mark Beech, who is an archaeologist working for what used to be ADACH and is now Abu Dhabi Tourism and Culture Authority. Mark has a Bachelor's of Science degree in archaeology from the Institute of Archaeology, UCL, a master's degree in environmental archaeology from the Department of Archaeology at the University of Sheffield, where he was born, and a PhD from the Department of Archaeology at the University of York. And he's been working in the region for 18 years. And he's a great guru. I always talk very fondly and have a great conversation. If I ever spend an evening with Mark, he really is a guru about this region on aspects of history, archaeology, society in general. It's a great pleasure to have you here, all three. So let me, having done the formalities, assure you that this is, and the best thing about these conversations is that they're informal, they are conversations. So, I mean, we're just going to kick off a conversation up here on the stage and then open it up to the audience to ask questions. So first, your book, David, concentrates on the period of really 36 to 39, but it also takes us up to 1949. In the prologue, it reviews the discovery of oil in the Middle East. So it does take us, it glances back to 1901, 1902, and the role of Darcy in the Anglo-Iranian and Anglo-Persian oil companies. And then in the epilogue, it has sort of arcs very quickly towards the present. But it concentrates on that period, the signing of the concessions from 36 to 39, which is a very short period. Now, given that you came here in 63, as I said in the introduction, which is the year that both I and Mark were born, and then your career has been spent since 63 in the Emirates. Why did you choose this period to write your book about?
Why did I choose this period? Well, first of all, welcome. Nice to see you here. And a particular welcome to two grandsons of the hero, my hero in the book, Mr. Abdul Rauf and Mr. Fadl, who are sitting here in the front. Yes, why did I write this book and why did I choose this period? Well, it's fairly straightforward, really. And first of all, why did I write it? Frequently, while I was writing it, I wondered why I was writing it too. Oh, goodness, why on earth have I started on this? Anyway, I got going and somehow things moved on. And then I thought I'd better round this story off with a little bit about early days to lead into the Emirates, or the Trucial Coast, it was then known. Then I sort of thought, well, I worked as a petroleum engineer. Perhaps I better explain a little bit about how oil is found or not found. And so the story developed. And then I had access to the company archives. This company is part of the Iraq Petroleum Company. You'll have seen the symbol come up on here, which you thought perhaps was ADCO, but it's not ADCO. These archives are in London. But of course, being company archives, they really are a bit of to an outsider, as I was outsider coming into it, they're a bit of a shambles, let's face it. It's individual people's files where they have kept things together that interested them, and they were, in due course, fortunately saved, but unfortunately weeded frequently because being an oil company, our interest is oil, not paying for office or storage space in London or anywhere else for that matter. And so they were weeded from time to time, bits and pieces disappeared, and I'm sure a number of interesting things disappeared. But one of the reasons why I started looking at these files was that I was asked by His Excellency Ahmed Khalifa al-Swaydi many years ago when he was foreign minister to see if I could find information in the files that was of interest to the people of Abu Dhabi and the history of the people of Abu Dhabi. You're all well aware that he was the moving spirit behind the Documentation Centre, now known as the National Centre for Documentation Research, and many other institutions in Abu Dhabi. And I went to London and asked, and came up against that brick wall that one frequently comes up against. And the answer was basically, well, it's a bit difficult, you know. They're down in the basement, and it's very dirty down there. You don't want to go down there. And. Well, it was absolutely true. It was very dirty down there. I didn't particularly want to go down. When the company moved offices about 10, 15 years ago now, I suppose, there was the usual downsizing and moving, and they moved them to yet another filthy, horrible London basement. But fortunately, the files are in boxes, closed boxes, so they haven't suffered from the dirt at all. It was Frauke and I who went there finally when we got permission to copy, and we copied them. And it was a pretty awful job, because every day when we arrived there, we would change into our other clothes, and we would wipe all the dirt of the previous night off the desks and tables and everything, and we got to work copying. Now, that was therefore the basis for my book was the information in these files, which I wanted to bring here to the Emirates, because it is an essential part of their history, which is not reproduced anywhere else. There are reports there, interesting reports there, which you will not find anywhere else. Interesting aspects on life in the Emirates, which you will not find anywhere else. So that was... Have I answered the question?
Yes, yes.
Oh,
but so
good.
So, I mean, you went with the documents that you could find from PCL.
Yes.
So in a nutshell, how would you describe the subject of the book? I described it as the period when the concessions were signed. Well, the options were first signed, and then the concessions were signed. So I was wondering, would you say that is the subject of the book?
Yes, I suppose so. I mean, I think perhaps it's summed up in my subtitle, How the Oil Industry Came to the United Arab Emirates. Because after all, although the geologists came in the late 30s, the negotiators came to talk with the rulers. None of them found oil or anything. That all came much, much, much later. But I thought there'd be some interesting stories in there, and I was quite surprised to find some very interesting stories in there. And so that was really how it developed. And I think, therefore, the subject, the book, obviously focuses on the Emirates, not just Abu Dhabi, although there is a good chunk in there about Abu Dhabi, but also Ras Al Khaimah and the relations and the strange goings on there with the ruler, the Sharjah and the discussions there between him and one of his sheikhs who resided near Jebel Faya, or the discussions with Sheikh Saeed bin Maktoum in Dubai, which went on and on and on until the British political resident, this is this fancy term, British political resident in Bushehr, summoned the ruler to Dubai, which upset quite a few people, not least the ruler, and to summon him to Bahrain, the ruler of Dubai. And he, of course, still refused to sign. It's in the book anyway, but he did sign in the end, but that's another story, which is all in the book.
So the nucleus of the book is really that period, 36 to 39, and then...
34,
right.
35. Yes, I mean, let's face it, the first geologists to come here were Anglo-Persian or Anglo-Iranian, that is BP. Later became BP. They were the first geologists and the first negotiators came here in the, back in the 20s, actually. They went into Oman, and Haji Williamson went with them in 1925, wasn't it? And there's the story of the lease chain and so on.
So I was wondering, could you, because we're in the 30s, say, that's the nucleus of the book, could you just say something about the history of the discovery of oil in the Middle East, to put that period in context?
Yes.
Historically, I mean, the UAE found oil much later than the rest of the...
Well, yes, and the question is why? Why much later? And the answer is quite simple. When Reynolds was drilling, it was drilling like this, not like this, in Persia, Iran. He found oil at a little more than 1,000 feet deep, but he was surrounded by pools of oil and stinking H2S gas and so on. And as he reported, another hazard was that the Bedou would light the gas because they didn't want their flocks to be poisoned by the gas, their sheep and goats. So instead, they were incinerated, but they lit the gas to get rid of it. So that was Iran, and then if you look through the Gulf southwards, you will see that the oil is ever deeper, deeper, deeper. Now, the geologists, they were looking for surface indications. That is obviously surface seepages, as I was talking about in Iran. But then there's also rock structures. And you look around in the desert of Abu Dhabi, you don't see much in the way of rock structures. It's more or less horizontal if you get underneath the sand, the rock layers. And as you know, it's more than 8,000 feet down here before you get to oil. So there's no seepage to the surface either. Whereas you go back to Qatar at 6,000 feet, Saudi Arabia a bit less, Kuwait rather less, all the way up to Kirkuk in Iraq, which is a little over 1,000 feet, I think, something like that. So you can see that gradation down the Gulf. And so when the geologists dismissed Abu Dhabi Desert as being very low prospect, it was perfectly reasonable with the facilities they had, the tools they had at that time. There was no way of seeing. And in fact, when one actually drilled the first well at Ras Sadr in 1950, they used a rig which was rated to the great depth of 10,000 feet, and they drilled down to 13,000 feet, which was the deepest well in the Middle East then, cost over £1 million, took 13 months, and they found nothing.
Yes, David, a little bird that motivates told me that your original manuscript was even longer than the 623 pages. I was interested to know about the process where you compiled the book and what actually was cut out. I mean, I know there was certain editing, but I want to know what are the missing stories that we're missing from the longer manuscript. What were maybe it's difficult to say, but maybe you can give us a kind of roundabout answer.
That's the IPC symbol. Sorry, I wasn't trying to dodge the question. Yes, what did I cut out? Well, first of all, of course, I got writing, and I got up to more than 600 pages, and I sort of only got to 1946, so I stopped. I thought that was quite enough for one book. And then the publisher, Motivate, did say this is a bit too long. Basically, what happened was that you will see in the text, there is quite a lot of text that is smaller type than the main text. And these are direct quotations. Now, I wanted to reproduce company documents in toto, complete, at the end as appendices. This meant, of course, that sometimes I was being repetitive. I had already referred to them in the text, perhaps, or even quoted them a little bit in the text to make the text sensible. So what I did was I cancelled quite a number of those appendices, which would have been the company documents in toto, and quoted or expanded on the quotation in the text. So there are one or two interesting stories missing, but they are ones where I thought, let's be a little bit diplomatic, perhaps. Not too much.
I found it fascinating, some of the appendices. In many ways, actually, the sort of, the devil is in the detail, as they say, and some of the appendices are fascinating. One of the appendices that particularly grabbed my attention was Appendix 48, which is Lermit to Longrig. This was a letter sent on, I think, 11th of February 1938. And just if I read just the sort of section, it's the PS on the letter. I always find PSs in letters are the most interesting bit of the letter. And it's very interesting insight into how Abu Dhabi was at that time. It says, food and water are a real problem here. Vegetables, fruit and meat are unobtainable, and I have to bring all from Dubai. Water is undrinkable, and the amount of undiluted seawater I have had to drink under the guise of coffee is amazing. Anyway, I think it's very interesting insight, and he goes on to describe the general situation. Now, that's 1938. How was it for you when you arrived sometime later? There was already water supply to Abu Dhabi in
No.
60s, or still?
The pipeline from Alain, the first pipeline from Alain, was built in 65, 64. There was what they called the baler, which is a corruption of boiler, which means a desalination plant on the beach, which was set up a short time before that. No, we were fortunate. We were along the coast in Tarif and had our own camp there, although the amount of fresh water available was minimal because the boiler was always breaking down. It was always breaking down and so on. And our fruit and vegetables, well, I mean, there are one or two people in the audience here who were here in those days. Perhaps they can answer better than I can what it was like in Abu Dhabi, because we were pampered a little bit in our camp in Tarif, and were very fortunate.
What was the most difficult thing in writing this book? I mean, you mentioned about the dusty archive. I know yourself and your dear wife Frauke spent a long time in this dusty basement going through these documents, but the actual from the process of the beginning, it was more than 10 years, I believe. Was that right?
The whole process was more than 10 years, and actual writing was probably about 3 years, maybe more. I really don't know because the date of starting writing. But anyway, it was a long time, and at times one felt, oh goodness, why on earth have I started doing this? And at other times I felt like getting on with it. I think the most difficult thing was that there are so many other attractions in this world and much more enjoyable than sitting at a computer or whatever and writing. As Frauke knows so well, she's always on about this, that there's so many other nice things to do and why she's stuck there in front of that computer screen. But
you didn't have to do it all in London.
No, I did most of it here. I copied the material in London and brought it here. And so no, most of the writing was here, or of course when we were on holiday in North Wales or in Munich, then I also did spend quite a bit of time on it there. But yes.
David, you have some interesting characters in the book. Not all British.
No.
Would you like to tell us the sort of more interesting characters, the people?
There's Haji Williamson on the left there, with Sheikh Rakbut and Sheikh Khalifa bin Zayed. Oh, well, first Sheikh Khalifa bin Zayed. Other interesting characters.
Who were the characters that really grabbed you, that you felt, that you really would like to explore a bit more about these people, and that they had a significance in the way things developed? And who are it's almost like there are some good guys and bad guys.
Oh, yes.
It's almost
I think one of the characters that I got to like more as time went by was Longrig. Now, Longrig was a bit of a mystery. I've asked people who actually worked with him in London what they thought of him, and they said, oh, his door was always shut and we never saw very much of him. He was always sitting there writing. He did write a number of good books on Middle Eastern subjects, 2, I believe, on Iraq, and so on. And there was much more to the man than I had at first understood, and I was certainly not very sympathetic with him at the beginning, on the contrary. But when he did finally come here, and as I say, at one point he came nearly here, because he came but he didn't come, he stayed in the ship offshore. By the end, I really did that's not me, that's him. And I did actually quite like him, and I feel he's someone who it would be interesting to get to know more about, but I think it's probably extremely unlikely that one can find out more. His son has also passed away, and I've been in contact with his daughter-in-law.
At the time, Longrig was in charge of PCL.
Longrig was, yes. The hierarchy was that there was the top man and then Longrig. And Longrig was based either in Cairo, during the course of this story, either in Cairo or in Haifa, or sometimes in Baghdad, where the company all had its operations.
And we talk about WikiLeaks in this modern day and age, and I'm sure you're very aware of WikiLeaks, but there are some sort of WikiLeaks types of, adventures all the way back in the 1930s. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the documentation leaks or the WikiLeaks of Pearl Stillwell?
Well, I don't know. I think it's a bit difficult. First of all, I don't follow WikiLeaks, I'm afraid, so I don't know much about that. That's again Longrig, you see, on the middle left. Sheikh Zayed, Longrig, Sheikh Khalifa bin Zayed al-Awwal, and Sheikh Mohammed bin Khalifa, the father of Sheikh Takhnoon in Alain, Sheikh Saror, and the late Sheikh Mubarak, and Sheikh Hamdan, and so on. Yeah, I think the
intrigue then.
Yeah.
I mean, there's plenty of intrigue in the story.
There is an awful lot of intrigue in there, but I think I think you summed it up fairly well earlier when you said that, Mark, that a friend of yours had delved into the book and had complained that he didn't really know who was responsible to who, or who was he working for, or he working for, whose interest was he pursuing, or he pursuing. And I think that comes through fairly clearly that, for example, Holmes, who is a bit of a bête noire so far as I'm concerned, I'm not convinced that when he was sitting all that time in Dubai, commissioned by and paid for by PCL, I'm not convinced that he didn't have other... There he is. There he is. I'm not convinced that he wasn't following up on other interests. He maintained all that time that he was in Dubai his friendship with the people in Bahrain that he had worked with before, who were very much involved with the Caltex, the American oil company in Bahrain. And I'm not convinced that Holmes was being entirely straight on that. As for Haji Williamson, I'm quite sure that while he was working for PCL, before that for APOC, I'm quite sure he was 100% loyal to his company, and that he was completely different from Holmes in that respect. What happened after he was very badly treated, and there he is, and not permitted to return to the Trucial Coast, there are accusations that he was pressing the interests of all other people. I'm not convinced of that, but there were groups in Iraq. There were various companies. There was BOD, British Oil Development, which actually was owned, I think, more by the Italians than by the British. And there were other companies too who were working in the area trying to get concessions, and so maybe he had been in contact with them. They would almost certainly have contacted him.
I find that Haji Williamson is one of the most powerful characters you mention in the book. I mean, if you were looking at your book and wanting to make the sort of Hollywood movie, he would be one of the characters, I think, to choose from it. I mean, for those of you who haven't read the book, I mean, he left Bristol in England aged 13.
There he is again.
Set off on a steamer, and he went to...
Not a steamer, a sailing ship.
Sailing ship. And he ended up in America, joining the gold rush for a while in California. He then eventually ended up in Aden, became a policeman in Aden. Again, at a remarkably young age, he learnt Arabic, he converted to Islam, and eventually sailed in his vessel up and down the Gulf. And he seemed to have a remarkably adventurous life. I mean, myself and my friend who recently read the book, who were saying, who was this guy working for? You know, what was he really doing? Because it really comes through intriguing. And he actually died in Basra in Iraq in, I think, 1950 or 58, yeah. So he had an amazing life, I would make a movie of this guy's life.
Yes, I would agree, except for one thing. I wouldn't say necessarily Hollywood, because there's no female part in this.
Well,
so you talked about the sort of almost the frustration about how long it took to write the book. 10 years. You started, and then it just took an age or so, it seemed to you. Which brings me to a thought I had, or a question I had as I was, or something I underlined actually as I was reading through my notes, which is that PCL, so Petroleum
Concessions Limited,
so which was the British-based company that evolved from
the ADPC.
APOC and IOC, right?
IPC.
Based in London, Longrid worked for them. Mm-hmm. Now, they thought back in 35 or 36 that it would take 2 to 3 months for whoever it was that was working for them, i.e. Holmes, perhaps Haji Williamson, and one or two other characters. They thought it would take 2 to 3 months to get those concessions. It ended up that they signed 2 concessions quite quite soon, the one with Dubai, but the ones with, notably with Sheikh Shahbout in Abu Dhabi and others took a lot longer. They took 3 years. And in the course of those 3 years, we are taken through in your book these sort of appearances and disappearances of Holmes and Haji Khalifa, Haji Williamson, and one or two other characters, actually. So there is an intrigue. Now, you can explain that delay by the fact that the people, well, PCL had underestimated the difficulties. They weren't perhaps as properly committed in the way that they should have been. But there was a lot of ignorance on the part of PCL as well as HMG, Her Majesty's government, and perhaps the government in India, about the security concerns that were bound to be involved in the whole operation of getting concessions, about the border issues, a basic ignorance about the Trucial Coast, actually, which is quite shocking, actually. Even basic things like the area that Abu Dhabi covered, and so how do you explain those 2 to 3 months turning into 3 to 4 years? Because that's what the book's about. That's what the narrative is all about, and that's how the characters are involved in this.
Well, I think there are various aspects of this. First of all, the British government was basically operated through the British government in India. And that was, you have to read the history of the British presence in India to understand that. And here, the Trucial Coast was very much off on the side so far as Bombay was concerned. Very small population of little interest. And really, the only reason for entering into the treaties of 1820 or so onwards was to secure the route to India. The British had no interest whatsoever in going into the interior or interfering in the interior. Of course, that did change in time. Let's continue a little bit therefore on the British interest here, that in time when APOC, or became BP, wanted to send people here, the British government was rather protective about it. And I think with good reason. As I mentioned before, there were all sorts of entrepreneur-type people around in the, fishing for concessions, fishing for various, wanting to make contact with the sheikhs and do things. And some of them were not particularly savory types. And you can read up on this. Some of it's in the book, but not very much. So I think the British government wanted to be a bit protective of these people. And then when a company did come along that they approved of, namely APOC, the British government didn't want to muddy the waters really by having lots of companies coming here. And that was where you come to what I call the trump card, that they told then the rulers that the first here is APOC, therefore you will negotiate with APOC. And in brackets afterwards, if it all falls apart and comes to nothing, then we talk again. And then there was the second, you could say the second trump card, was after they had signed with Sheikh Zayed in Dubai, then the British government said, well, you have signed up with one company, and we don't want a whole lot of companies, one in Dubai, one in Abu Dhabi, because it was a small place in those days, and really it would have been a bit of a nonsense. So that was the British government being protective and looking after the interests. They felt, not just British interests, but very much also the best interests of the people here. Now, the oil side, I mentioned APOC. APOC, or Anglo-Iranian as it became, or then BP, they were the first in the area. But at the time of the, let's say after the First World War, when the IPC was being reorganized, sorted out, the various companies involved, including, the various companies that were involved in the IPC, which is more than the current shareholders, there were a few other American companies involved too, came to what was called the Red Line Agreement, and you'll have seen a map maps up here from time to time, and you may have been able to discern a red line which goes around Kuwait like that, and then around the Gulf and all the way around and up through the Red Sea. And these companies agreed that they would not operate in that area, which included the Trucial Coast and Oman. They would not operate on their own in that area, but they would only operate as a group. That was the Red Line Agreement. The line was driven by Gulbenkian, and as I say here, I believe he drew it on the map, sort of almost freehand. And anyway, he did it. Good for him. And the Red Line Agreement actually stood for about, well, it started to fall apart within about 15, 20 years, but never mind. That meant that when Anglo-Persian or BP came here, they had to get permission from, yes, you can see it runs around through. It looks as though it's the route that the steamer takes, except that it heads inland by Kuwait. So anyway, that's it. They had to get permission from the other people in the Red Line Agreement group, that is the French, the Americans, Shell. And they were then authorized by the group to continue their operations on the Trucial Coast and to try to get the, first of all, the options and then the concession agreements. But after they got the options, these actually were transferred from APOC or BP to the group as a whole, PCL. And that brought problems, because obviously in PCL, they wanted to say, we are not the same as APOC, therefore Haji Williamson, he is APOC, out with him. We will bring this wonderful Frank Holmes, who was later known in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Bahrain as Abu Naft, the father of petroleum. And he did do no, I mustn't go on about that. So they brought in, as it were, a new team. But then the geologists wanted to bring Haji Williamson back in because of his value, and other people wanted to bring him back in because of his knowledge of the area and his expertise. But Holmes, who wasn't getting anywhere, therefore thought, goodness, this man, Williamson, is contriving behind my back to turn the rulers against me. And he really got quite a bee in his bonnet about this, poor Holmes, and he wasn't getting anywhere, and he blamed, therefore, Haji Williamson for it, and so on. So there was that, and Haji Williamson, in one letter, pointed out that he had this problem, that Holmes thought that he was being derogatory about him, Holmes, to the rulers, which wasn't the case at all.
Talking about understanding with rulers, you mentioned in the book about the early days of PCL management, and you mentioned something that I found interesting, that you said that the PCL's management were ignorant of the extent of authority of Sheikh Shagbud. And I wonder why this was the case. You mentioned a very charming phrase on page 305, which is a saying in Arabic, which I like very much, which is very relevant today still, actually, for many people who live in this country. And the expression in Arabic says, you are in one wadi and I am in another. Literally, you know, you're in different places and not quite understanding and coming together.
Yes. Well, it wasn't quite so much that as just there was a general ignorance all round of conditions here. And for example, you're probably all familiar with the Lorimer work, which was produced in the early part of the last century, a very detailed work about this area. But it wasn't available to people outside the India office. The company did not have access to that. So PCL or IPC or whatever, they were ignorant of it. Many of the administrators who became political agents, political officers, or whatever you like to call them, were also very ignorant of the area. And let's face it, the first European Englishman to ever visit the Liwa was Wilfrid Thesiger in 1948. And how did he get there? He came from Dhofar, from Salalah, not Dhofar, from Salalah. So, Dhofar. So, you know, Abu Dhabi, the Emirates, were very much unknown quantities in those days. And as for the borders meant nothing, because this was all open land, and tribes moved here and there, and they had their own dar there. And borders, they were of no significance whatsoever until there was the possibility of finding something down underneath there, and then all of a sudden borders became significant. And that was where Sheikh Saeed and Sheikh Shakbut very early on recognized this, Sheikh Saeed bin Maktoum in Dubai. They recognized this and said, we must talk about where that border is. But unfortunately, it came to nothing in spite of the efforts of Ahmed bin Khalaf al-Otaiba.
David, you mentioned, how, and Mark just also raised about how things were then, and Mark compared to how things are today. And this is all about concessions and concession renewal. And we're going through concession renewal today. We're in the process. And Philip mentioned about how long everything took and things. And there are people today, maybe not in the audience, but certainly in Abu Dhabi, in the oil industry, who are questioning the sort of, the length of time and things. What are the sort of comparisons that you can make with the 1930s and today?
That's very difficult, and I don't really want to get onto today. But,
what are the lessons that we can learn?
I think one of the lessons that we are all learning, and if anyone living in Abu Dhabi hasn't learned the lesson, that patience is patience, patience, patience. And, our Arab friends, they have their way of doing things. We have our way of doing things. We can be very impatient. I can remember several occasions when I was impatient and was fairly bluntly rebuked. And he was right, actually, to rebuke me. So I think patience. And we tend to see things our way, don't we? We tend to see this as being important, this as being must be done today, and so on and so forth. And of course, frequently, other people are coming at it from a different angle. They don't see the same urgency, and perhaps there isn't the same urgency after all.
And Mark also, talked about the sort of the fruit and water issues. Again, what are the lessons there that, maybe the generations today can learn from reading the book? And, is there a thought maybe to turn it into Arabic for some of the younger students to read this? There are lots of history books in the classrooms here, but not many of them from the Abu Dhabi, from the region.
Absolutely.
Wouldn't it be nice to have, something like this in the UAE classrooms?
Yes. My great regret, which I have expressed in here, is that I have not been able to draw on any local Arab sources. And I'm quite sure that there were more letters written, and even letters written quite clearly between the various rulers. We know that from what I've read, that there were letters written between the various rulers. And these have all disappeared, sadly. And that would really, bring my story really to life and complete it. But I have tried, and I have tried to represent the local side of it to a certain extent. I mean, I did spend a lot of time with Sheikh Shakbut, for example, in the earlier middle of my time here. And I think I got to know him. I wouldn't say I got to, that would be too bold to say I got to understand him. It's very difficult when people of a completely different culture to get very, very close. Anyway, I tried my best, and I think, I hope I have in this book tried to represent the Arab and the Abu Dhabi side of things, perhaps very unsatisfactorily.
And to turn it into Arabic?
Oh, I think that would be... I think our local friends would find quite a few interesting stories there that they'd be reluctant to spend the time going through them in the English. But I mean, there are things like when Sheikh Shakbut tried to bring the Shamsis and Nuaimis out of their, they were isolation. They were trying to, let's say, when they were not fighting one another, but had a period of truce where they were really wondering whether they could establish themselves as independent of Oman, certainly of Abu Dhabi, and they even went to Saudi Arabia to try to get help for that, and they didn't get the help they'd hoped for, and so on. These sort of things, yes, of course. But even like the piece you read, it's just a reminder of what life was like here in the old days, when it really was quite hard. I am going to no longer resist the temptation to too bad
Read
to
your
read
favorite.
my favorite section, if I haven't lost it. Yes. To try to illustrate the really two extremes. I can picture Higginbotham, a wonderful name, isn't it? He was the British political agent in Bahrain visiting Sharjah. Higginbotham and Holmes sitting together in wicker basket chairs on the veranda of the PCL house overlooking the creek in Dubai. The sun is going down and they are enjoying their first gin and tonic for or lime for the evening before going inside to pull up their chairs to the table to enjoy dinner served with silver cutlery, white linen, and accompanied by a glass of wine. Perhaps later they were joined by friends from Sharjah for a rubber of bridge. Meanwhile, Haji Williamson is sitting in a circle of Arabs on a carpet spread on the sand, chatting and sipping from their tiny coffee cups. A poet interrupts their conversation, imposing his rhyming doggerel on an appreciative audience, before they all rise to wash and prepare for the Maghrib prayer. Later, the freshly prepared dishes of rice and fish are laid on the circular rush mat on the floor, and everyone seated on the carpet reaches forward to take a scoop of rice, mold it into a small ball between the fingers of his right hand, and neatly pop it into his mouth. They wash again under the ewer of water poured into the small basin and carried around by a servant before they take another sip of coffee. The small clay incense burner is passed around before they depart silently into the night, carrying with them the gentle smell of oud.
Thank you.
I'm quite pleased with that, actually.
I noticed the figure of Yusuf bin Ahmed Kanu, who was another one of the
Yes.
big players in the
Wonderful
book.
man.
We haven't talked about him. And do you want to
Yes,
say
he
something about him?
was a businessman in Bahrain. He was the agent, among other things, for Anglo-Persian. After Anglo-Persian, Anglo-Iranian BP set up their refinery in Abadan, they exported, in particular, kerosene around the Gulf, which was used for cooking. Unfortunately, also caused a lot of fires in Barasti huts. But there were therefore agents for the sale of this stuff established in various places around the Gulf, and Haji Williamson's job was one of his jobs was to go around and check on the agencies. And Haji Yusuf bin Ahmed Kanu was the agent in Bahrain. But he also traveled down here, and Sheikh Shakbut regarded him as a friend. He was also on friendly terms with Sheikh Saeed in Dubai and Sheikh Sultan bin Salam, the ruler of Ras Al Khaimah. And we know he corresponded with them by letter. Sadly, who knows where the letters have got to? But that's not surprising, I suppose. But he was highly respected. But in the late 30s, when the world was really descending into the most awful economic depression, Haji Yusuf also had his financial problems. And he then took the initiative, actually, to get the company back to negotiating with Sheikh Shakbut. This was long after Haji Williamson had gone to Basra and was out of the picture. What I would love to know is what Haji Yusuf bin Ahmed Kanu thought of Haji Williamson, and vice versa, what they thought of one another, because they obviously met, they obviously had time together, and I can imagine that although they were extremely different people, they were also extremely, deeply religious, and I think they would have had an awful lot in common. But I don't know. I'd love to know. There are so many unanswered questions.
As a petroleum engineer and having studied geology and physics, I find it rather surprising that there isn't, a whole lot of stories about geology and technology and all that in your book. You kind of focused on the negotiations and went, through and through all the personalities and negotiations. So, was that by choice, or were there no stories available? When you read the story of oil discovery and development in other provinces, like in America, there are a lot of stories who are purely kind of technology based, like Drake's Well and all that. So if you can comment on that.
Yes, I think the answer to that is that the technical side of it really, that you're talking about, really didn't come into its own until after the Second World War. 1946, the first geological parties came back here, 47 seismic parties. Before that, the geological surveys that were conducted, I do refer to them in the book, but they were really, so far as Abu Dhabi is concerned anyway, really rather, not very much was achieved. But there wasn't very much to achieve because of the sand cover, of course. So I have given a sort of nod to technology and a nod to petroleum engineers and so on in the early part of the book, just to briefly explain what they do. But there wasn't actually, in the 30s, very much technical work going on. Also, my chief objective, I suppose, was to reproduce what was in the files. And there is very little in the files that is technical. I have reproduced some of the bits of the geological reports, but really there is very little there of interest to anyone. Yes, I take your point, but...
In his next book.
This is a new subject, David. I have just read 2 days back in the FT that Qatar gas issue, where the gas is going to go less and less, and there could be a problem, financial and otherwise, if they can't do anything to do with getting some equity partners. And the other thing is, you probably haven't, you read about this Qatar gas thing? This is something new. Okay, anyway, if you haven't read, I'm not going to ask you that question.
Thank you.
Okay. The other thing is, David, the most important thing is how they negotiated in the past, how all the Gulbenkian, the 5%, and the BP, and everybody became a shareholder. Then everything got nationalized, and then most of the oil companies, foreign oil companies, were getting a concession based on a barrel of oil. Now there are new negotiations. How do you think the future of negotiations should go? I'm not talking about any particular company. Because there is technology issue, there is investment issues, and there is a depleting oil in the ground.
Well, I don't particularly want to get into the future. I'd prefer to stick to my book, but I think there are things to learn from my book so far as this is concerned. First of all, so far as PCL was concerned, any involvement of the individual shareholders took place in London, not here. There were no people here from the individual shareholders in PCL. The PCL management was delegated to get on with the job, and that was the way it was. And the people here were all PCL people. They were not from any of the shareholding companies. Whether that is an appropriate sort of situation for today or not, I leave that to you to think about and discuss among yourselves.
Well, in your book, you actually mention a list of all the gifts and things that are donated to the sheikhs and things on various different occasions. And, you know, anti-bribery, corruption laws and things today will kind of dispel some of those, I'm afraid.
Yes, well, I included that because I thought it was an important part of the story.
Yeah.
And that was the way it was in those days. It was not bribery. It was seen as a reward for various services given. And I think it was reasonable because these were the people who were around Sheikh Shuckbut. And although it appears from, so far as we can determine, and there are no minutes taken of any of these meetings, unfortunately, not much in the way of reports of these meetings, and Sheikh Shuckbut seems to have, at the meetings, taken the leading role, if not been the only speaker. But I do not believe that back in the evenings, when they sat around in the majlis, they all sat there dumb and didn't say a word to him, and he didn't say a word to them. I'm sure, quite sure, they would have discussed these things among themselves, obviously. But we don't have any report of that, sadly.
David, you knew Sheikh Shuckbut. You read all the things that have been published by Frauke and others about him. And that is of the last...
Sorry,
period.
this is Haji Yusuf bin Ahmed Kanu. Sorry, Peter.
That's all right. That's of the period more or less after Sheikh Shuckbut stepped down. But from the reports in the IPC archives and what you put in the book, how has that changed your impression of what Shuckbut was like as a ruler, how he dealt with IPC? He comes across as a strong-minded man who knew his own mind. But have your own views, assessments of him changed as a result of the research you did?
I don't think so, really. I don't think so. He was, when he was ruler, he was at the pinnacle. He was there. He was the one who was responsible. He was the boss. When he no longer had those responsibilities, he was probably rather more relaxed and easygoing. But no, I don't think I changed my view on him significantly. I felt that I was reading the IPC, PCL reports with the benefit of having spent time with him and could therefore understand the position he took, his attitude much better. He, after all, was dealing with people who regarded him a little bit, perhaps almost cynically. Their initial attitude towards him was quite clearly that he is a simple Bedouin sheikh. And he was no simple man. On the contrary, he was a pretty smart man. And he was also fairly well informed, remarkably well informed. And I don't mean just in the more recent years when he had the BBC on all the time. Not all the time, but whenever the news was on.
And the Voice of America and all the rest of it.
But in earlier years too. And people like Haji Yusuf Kanu, who we had up there, would come, and many others would come. And of course, one of the first things, as you know, Haji Yusuf Kanu there, was Shu Akbar, what's the news? And the news would spread around, and it was amazing, really. You can see in the book how Haji Williamson got wind of what was going on down in Bahrain on the Trucial coast after he had got to Basra very quickly. The word got around quickly. So, and it wasn't through telephones and emails. No, I don't think my attitude, my feelings about him were significantly different.
Hi, my name is Hamed Al-Hamadi. First, I thank New York University for organizing such a wonderful event, and I thank Mr. David for the wonderful insights and all our guests here. My question is, probably you've been here during the time of first exploration of oil. I mean, you've experienced the first transformation in the region. Would you share with us, like, about the moment of exploring oil, like first day? What was it like? What was the few people's reaction? What was our ruler's reaction at that time? of the first exploration of oil?
Well, I could talk about that for a very long time. And I don't want to get too much, just very, very briefly, that in those days, it was a small place, we were a small operation, we were few people involved, we did not have many service companies. We, as petroleum engineers, we got in there and got our hands dirty. You had oil or cement or drilling mud coming up over your head or whatever. And I mean, we really got in there. And we had a great time running around in the desert in our little Land Rovers, short wheelbase. And it was hard work, very hard work. We worked long hours, and you get a call to go out to the drilling rig in the middle of the night. Okay, you leave Tarif and you go off and so on. But it was a good life, but it was hard. It was fun. And we did find some oil.
Can I ask a question related, not so much to the emotions of discovering oil, but from the book, it seems that the two geologists who did the surveys, when they could, were more interested in the mountain hinterland.
Yes.
So the hinterland of Sharjah, hinterland of Ras Al Khaimah.
That's right.
Towards Jebel Hafid. They weren't interested in the western region.
No.
Partly for the reasons that you have already explained, that the oil beds were so much deeper than they had. What they must. Sorry, the geological surveys that took place in the book that we read about, Williamson and his forgotten his cohorts.
Yes. Yeah.
When did they take place in the western region? In
the western region, well, there was this trip in 1937 where they set out, and you've seen a picture of the car bogged down in the Subka. So they turned around and came back and then loaded it onto a dhow, which also was a picture up there. And then there's another picture of the three cars, the saloon car, the white van, which is on the right of the picture, and on the left, the pickup. Yeah. There they are, on the dhow, heading off to, I think it was just the other side of Jebel Damna, Abu Mareka, that area, where they came ashore. And the thing was that in the agreement, Sheikh Shakbut was to receive a copy of geological reports. And he received this geological report and said, there's nothing on it. And, of course, it all went back up the line to London. Alarm, Sheikh Shakbut says there's nothing on it. And the word came back, well, actually, there is nothing. So how do you give a map with nothing on it? Anyway, it was there wasn't really very much in the western region to look at, and of course they couldn't go far down into the sand anyway. It would have been quite impossible with those vehicles. You can see this car here. As I said before, it was really the mountains that were interesting. And the company drilled several wells in Oman in those early days of the 50s. And that was where the focus was on the mountains. And of course they drilled at Fahud and didn't find anything because they drilled on the wrong side of a fault, and that's another story.
Okay, having done all this research and, what do you think today? Means the deal that Sheikh Shakbut signed in 1939, was it a fair deal for Abu Dhabi? And considering that the amount that was paid, 325,000 rupees, and 40,000 rupees per year after that, that's today is less than the salary of thousands of Indian expats that come here. Their monthly salary is less than that. So do you think it was a fair deal considering the time and the place and the situation?
Yes, I think it was a very fair deal. As I said before, the prospect, the chances of finding oil in Abu Dhabi at that stage were not rated very high. A few 100,000 rupees then converted into today's money, an awful lot of money. And you will see, for example, when Sheikh Shakbut wanted the company to give this big party for a month in Al Ain, the report says that his normal handout to a passing Bedu was 2 rupees. The company was, of course, going to have to pay 4 rupees because it was the company, which upset them even more. So 2 rupees to the people here was already a significant sum. No, I think it was very much in line with the sort of agreements of that time. Now, the significant thing about that agreement was that as soon as we started to export oil, OPEC was flexing its muscles, and negotiations started right away with Sheikh Shakbut to have a new agreement to take account of the various OPEC requirements, such as profit sharing, relinquishment, and so on. But that's outside the realms of this book. But all I would say is that Sheikh Shakbut negotiated in 1965 a new agreement, and subsequent agreements. The old agreement of 1939 is from 1965 onwards was really irrelevant. It was the basis, of course, for existence of the company here, etc., etc. But no, for that time, it was a reasonable and fair agreement. And remember, too, during the years of the Second World War, those regular payments never ceased, not just to the ruler of Abu Dhabi, but to the ruler of Dubai, Sharjah, Ras Al Khaimah, Ajman, I'm not sure about Quwain, and Kalba. Fujairah didn't exist as an independent sheikhdom. So those payments were made, and they made a significant difference to the economy of this place in those days of terrible poverty.
Thank you. Congratulations again on the publication of the new book. And as an economics student in this university, I'm more interested in the economic implications of the history. So apparently there are many interesting stories that you have described about the difficulties that you have experienced in the development of the oil industry. But right now, I've think that the government is doing a little bit of transitioning more to the cultural side. They're focusing more to the cultural side. They're trying to reduce the amount that oil industry occupies in the national GDP in the future, maybe 30 years. And I think the cultural implication is that part of the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute is part of the product. So bearing that in mind, would you think that right now, the time that we're experiencing right now is a continuation of the history that we have experienced, or is actually a new phase of the development, which is actually mean that the end of the history that you have described in your book? Thank you.
Wow.
Easy question.
That is a question which I think one could debate for a very long time. You know, it was His Highness Sheikh Zayed who was quoted as saying that our history is important, and people, and many other people have also said that people without a history are history is very, very important, and we should learn from history. And I think there are, in fact, I think some people have managed to detect more lessons in this book than I've detected. There are lessons to be learned from history, yes. But on the other hand, times have moved on, new generations, new world that we're living in today, a very different world from the days of that I'm describing here. So it's a complicated matter which we could debate for ages and ages. I wanted to draw your attention to this. Whoops, it's gone now. Never mind. There were 2 letters came up there in Arabic.
Yes.
One, this is from Sheikh Shakbut bin Sultan to the company, and I wanted just to show them because the Arabic writing I think is rather nice, and I wanted to show you something Arabic and something that was produced locally. And we have this letter, and the other letter is written by Sheikh Saeed in Dubai, Saeed bin Maktoum in Dubai, again to the company. And the Abu Dhabi one was in 1935. Sheikh Saeed, I think, is 37, I'm not sure.
This is Shakbut.
This is Shakbut's one. That's Said Maktoum. And I just wanted to put these up. Now, of course, in those days, the rulers, the sheikhs, had people to do their writing for them. In the same way, Frauke reminded me earlier, every German king or prince in earlier days, well, would regard it as rather infra-dig to write his own letters. You have someone to do that for you. So they had scribes who produced this lovely script.
You didn't have air conditioning. You said water was minimal. Sandstorms come to mind. I just wonder if you could just sort of reminisce a little bit about the day-to-day life and the hardships you had to put up with, and also about the people. I think we all want to know more about your impressions of the people. Did you get, how often did you meet with them? Just things like that. Just a bit, please.
Well, yes. I mean, this is outside the book, but first of all, you mentioned sandstorms. I can only remember in my first years here one serious sandstorm, and that was, you see, here the prevailing wind is northwest, so it comes over the Gulf. So you don't get the sort of sandstorms that you get further west in Kuwait and so on. If you get a Suhaili blowing from the south here, you can get a sandstorm. Or if you have a strong shamal, you move down into the desert, you may get a bit of a significant sandstorm. I remember going southwards in the far west with one man from Ras Al Khaimah and Yusuf and I forget who else. And we had to stop because it was just impossible to see any further in the Land Rover. But that didn't happen very often. I remember the first sandstorm I drove in, that was that one, and not many more. And I remember the first time I drove under a cloud, and that was 2 months after coming here. I've driven under a lot more since. But it was just something that you remember about. But as for hard life, yes, I suppose it was hard, but we were young. It didn't really matter. And you know, you'd sit in your little Land Rover and open up these vents to get the hot air to blow in, and you would sweat like anything. But it didn't matter. I mean, you just got on with things. And the fact that you got out to the drilling rig and there was no fresh water to wash in, obviously not. You've had showers there with a salinity 3 or 4 times the salinity of seawater. But you know, so what? But we enjoyed it. And the people, well, in those early days, I met, as I mentioned, this man, Yusuf from Ras Al Khaimah. I met a number of the people, the local people, but in those days, all the workers, the people around the drilling rigs and so on, the workers were nationals, Abu Dhabi nationals, not from anywhere else. There weren't many Abu Dhabi people, in fact, there were hardly any who had just got to even a level of foreman. There was one in particular who was a good friend, Mohammed, passed away now about 20 years ago. But it wasn't really, I suppose, until a few years later and we moved into the town of Abu Dhabi that one got to meet other people, other nationals of different levels in society, as opposed to the sort of people one met out at the drilling rig or when one was testing wells and so on and so forth. And of course, that to meet a broader range of national people in the town in Abu Dhabi was very, very, it was wonderful. And one, through that, of course, learned to understand the people here much better and to broaden one's whole outlook on life. It was great.
Could you spend a few minutes talking about the state of the pearl industry during the time period of your book?
I'm not an expert on the pearling industry at all, but as you know, the pearling industry here was extremely important. But what destroyed that was, first of all, the economic depression and the world depression and the market loss, but also the introduction of Japanese cultured pearls. And So by the time I came here, I don't think there were any pearling dhows in 1963 going out from Abu Dhabi. Maybe from Bahrain, I don't know, or Kuwait, but I don't think there were any going out from Abu Dhabi. I certainly never heard of any. But I remember working on a well once, and we were just a gang of local men, myself and the foreman, and they had to pull on a rope, on a pipe, to move a pipe. And pulling on this rope, there were a whole line of them, and they sang the song, the pearling. When they were pulling a diver out of the water, this was what they sang. So that was my closest contact I ever had with anything to do with pearling, out in the desert, in the sand.